On October 6, 1939, the world stood shocked as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union ruthlessly carved up Poland. Britain and France, the dedicated protectors of European safety, watched powerless. But for some, just watching means nothing. Imperial Japan was carefully evaluating the newest developments and was reconsidering its options. The secret dealings of their supposed friend, Germany, with their decades-long enemy, the USSR, made them extremely suspicious. With their own situation in China growing unstable, Japan began to consider a bold move, shifting allegiance to Britain, an old ally now desperate for support. Could this be the moment Japan changed the course of World War II? Today in history, we delve into the complicated politics of the first years of World War II and wonder what would have happened if Japan joined the side of Britain and France in 1940. Welcome to History, your source for alternate history entertainment. The exploration of likely events from the past and their effects on the world. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Chapter 1. 22 September through 6 October 1939. The German Treachery. The 6th of October 1939 is one of the most symbolically important days of World War II. It was the last time Adolf Hitler reached out to his enemies and asked for peace. Standing triumphant in the Reichstag in Berlin, Hitler tried to persuade Britain and France that the reason they had declared war on his country 1 month ago had stopped existing. Poland was no more. For the Allies, this was just a propagandistic speech, and they saw no meaning to the German proposal. But on the other side of Eurasia, the Japanese had their ears open. What were Hitler's goals, and what did his moves mean for them and their glorious empire's future? The contacts between Germany and Japan before 1936 were limited. The two countries found themselves on opposite sides during World War I, and Japan captured and held many of Germany's imperial positions in Asia and the Pacific. The complicated world situation of the 1930s and both countries' inner developments led to the rise of militaristic political movements that brought them closer together. On 25 November 1936, they signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, an agreement that was directed against the agitatory moves of the Third Communist International based in Moscow. The agreement had further implications, as it made clear the ideological closeness of the two regimes and was targeting the Soviet Union as a common foe. Through it, Japan came closer to the Axis alliance, which formed in 1936 between Germany and Italy. The signing of the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the USSR went against this diplomatic precedent. How could the empire trust such a two-faced politician like Hitler, who with one hand signed against the USSR, while with the other signing with it? Prime Minister Hironuma Kishiro, whose policy was an effort to balance between the different camps formed around Germany and Britain, was brought under heavy critique for indecisiveness. The former Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe argued for closer relations with Germany and entrance into the Axis to assure Germany of Japan's allegiance, while others, such as the Foreign Minister Hachiro Arita and the ambassador in Moscow and previously in Berlin, Shigenori Togo, pushed for the pro-British stance. With the crisis unveiling, Kishiro was forced to resign, and the pro-British admiral Mitsumasu Yonai was appointed prime minister by Emperor Hirohito on 30 August 1939. Arita retained his position. But the crisis did not stop. Just 1 day later, on 31 August, large Japanese forces in Mongolia, fighting against the USSR in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, were destroyed by the Soviet army, losing more than 8,000 men. A humiliating agreement was signed on 15 September, which forced Japan to accept the Soviet-Mongolian demands on the border region, without even going into an official war. With the USSR dominant in the east and presumably free in the west from the German threat, the Japanese position in Manchuria and China seemed precarious. In the early hours of 7 October 1939, the Japanese ambassador in London, Mamoru Shigemitsu, was ordered from Tokyo to ask for an urgent meeting with the British Foreign Minister, Edward Wood, ideally before a decision on the German peace proposal was made. There was something important to discuss. October 1939 through 15 November 1939. Meeting with an old friend. When Wood's secretary informed him of Shigemitsu's request, the British foreign minister was confronted with a complicated dilemma. Great Britain and Japan had formed an important alliance in 1902 and fought effectively together in the First World War. Japan proved itself a valuable ally, not only by neutralizing German forces in Asia and the Pacific, but also by deploying its fleet to assist the Entente in the Mediterranean. However, the Anglo-Japanese alliance ended in 1923, and during the interwar years, tensions arose between the two countries. Japan's expansionist policies in China after 1931, especially following the full-scale invasion in 1937, alienated the British. Consequently, Britain refused to recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo and participated in international sanctions, including an arms embargo on Japan. Despite these tensions, the British government, up until 1939, had followed a policy of appeasement, meaning that relations with Japan were not beyond repair. Wood might have recalled at that moment Italy's decision during the First World War to switch allegiances from the Central Powers to the Entente, thus decisively altering the war's outcome. Perhaps Japan presented a similar opportunity. Therefore, when Shigemitsu came knocking on his door, Wood had good reasons to open it. Wood headed first to Downing Street. After an urgent meeting with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that lasted nearly an hour, the two men agreed that meeting with the friends of their enemies before consulting the French would be a serious diplomatic misstep. The meeting with the Japanese ambassador was therefore delayed and scheduled for October 9th, after France consented. On that day, Wood and Shigemitsu met and agreed that the dangers of Soviet-Nazi cooperation were too great for both countries. Wood, as required, maintained a firm stance accusing the Japanese government of constant aggressiveness, imperial arrogance, and blatant disregard for international law. These remarks underscored Britain's reservations about proceeding with an agreement, but also indicated that cooperation was not off the table. Stealing an ally from Hitler and strengthening the Allied position against the unpredictable USSR were compelling reasons to consider almost any diplomatic avenue. The next step was to organize a higher-level meeting, and both sides agreed that a visit by the Japanese foreign minister to London was necessary to rebuild a trusting relationship. After the British and French rejected the German peace proposal on October 12th, Hashiro Arita scheduled his diplomatic mission for the following month, on November 12th. Arita's visit created havoc in the British Parliament, sparking lengthy debates about the wisdom of such a sudden shift in British foreign policy. However, war changes everything, and public opinion was swayed by the argument that all efforts should be made to improve Britain's position against the Nazi menace. Arita's arrival made headlines in the British and international media, signaling a potentially significant shift in the global balance of power. After 3 days of intense discussions between the two foreign ministers and their diplomatic missions, Arita, Wood, and Shigemitsu signed a neutrality pact on November 15th that clearly identified their common enemy. According to the pact, Japan assured the inviolability of the British territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, while Britain confirmed its recognition and defense of Japan's position in Korea and Formosa. The difficult issue of Manchukuo was left for later negotiations. Depending on the level of assistance Japan was willing to provide Britain in its war against Germany. More importantly, in a secret protocol, both countries agreed to enter the war on each other's side in the event of an attack by the USSR. As Japan was more threatened by such a scenario than Britain would assist without conditions, while Japan agreed to assist on the condition that France also participated in the war. The French government was duly informed. November 1939 through 1 March 1940. The world is shaking. The agreement sent shockwaves across the globe. The USSR was the first to react, denying any aggressive intentions and condemning the pact as an alliance of imperialist powers, targeting the only real defender of the world's oppressed. Interestingly, the USSR omitted any mention of its similar pact with Germany, signed just 3 months earlier, and did not hesitate to invade Finland only 3 weeks later, on November 30th. The Axis powers responded more cautiously. Hitler, understanding Japan's concerns after the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, decided to respond in a conciliatory tone to this retaliatory diplomatic move. In a German Foreign Ministry statement, the pact was described as evidence of the peaceful aims of Japan, Germany, and Italy, all of whom were outside the League of Nations, while also being a confirmation of Japan's anti-communist stance following the anti-Comintern Pact. The statement downplayed any threat to Japanese-German relations or Germany's war efforts against Britain. Italy echoed these statements. Behind the scenes, however, the reaction was different. Hitler ordered German Ambassador Eugen Ott to immediately meet the Japanese foreign minister, demanding details about the pact, especially concerning military cooperation. In a meeting on 25 November, Arita assured Ott that no weapons delivery or sharing of military technology was agreed, but he also used the chance to warn Ott that Japan saw Germany's secretive dealings with the USSR as unfriendly. This discussion revealed two things: the fragility of German-Japanese relations in 1939, and Japan's use of the British Pact to assert its independence within a potential German alliance. The members of the Commonwealth also responded with positive caution, with the Australian and New Zealand governments stating their hope for peace and prosperity in the Pacific, and General Jan Smuts, Prime Minister of South Africa, congratulating his government, but remarking that the agreement was to be tested in practice before it proved its worth. The most significant reaction came from the U.S. The U.S. policy toward the Japanese moves in Asia was particularly strict. The U.S. refused to recognize Manchukuo and declared any developments in China following Japan's 1937 invasion as illegitimate. Washington viewed Britain's decision to sign a deal with an aggressive power that threatened U.S. interests in the Pacific with deep concern, and President Roosevelt demanded an explanation from Neville Chamberlain, considering the move irresponsible. Democrats called for a strong response and limits on U.S. support for Britain, while many Republicans pushed for strict isolationism. With the U.S. elections looming next year, Roosevelt faced a delicate situation. Recognizing the potential repercussions of the British-Japanese agreement on the crucial British-American relationship and the risk of alienating the United States from the British war effort, Chamberlain called on his French counterpart, Édouard Daladier, on 25 November, the same day of the German-Japanese talks in Tokyo. Daladier was alarmed. In his first chance to reflect on the British-Japanese agreement, he remarked to Chamberlain that granting so many concessions to the Japanese in Asia in exchange for vague promises he found difficult to fully trust, seemed to him a significant miscalculation. However, Chamberlain's response, as recorded, was overwhelming. People might think it irresponsible, even foolish, to engage in another round of appeasement with a revisionist and aggressive power. I am not naive. I know the Japanese are simultaneously courting the Germans. But what choice do we have? Every day that prevents Hitler from gaining more power is a day won. We must bring the Americans on board at any cost. Once Germany is defeated, We will have the time and opportunity to restore our rightful position in Asia. Faced with this argument, Daladier found himself unable to mount a persuasive counter. The first meeting between the two men took place after many preparatory meetings between their staff in Paris on 15 December 1939. Chamberlain and afterward the Japanese ambassador Miyazaki Katsutaro formally invited France to join their pact. It was a difficult time for the French government. France was positioned perilously close to an enemy that had already overrun entire nations in a matter of weeks. Furthermore, international pressure from pro-fascist factions was mounting, urging France to come to terms with Hitler and end the war. Daladier therefore found it hard to commit to any further agreements, especially with Japan, an aggressive power that shook hands with Hitler only a couple of years earlier. But the looming German threat and the precarious French position in Indochina, threatened by Japan's policies, ultimately led to a reluctant decision to follow the risky British lead. A three-party meeting was then arranged in French Hanoi, taking place on 1 March 1940. The representatives from three countries, Edward Wood for Britain, George Catrow, the Governor-General of French Indochina, and Hashiro Arita for Japan, agreed that France would become the third signatory of the Neutrality Pact. But the atmosphere was not exactly celebratory. After widespread protests in Paris and other cities for France's handling of the war, Daladier was forced to resign on 21 March. 1 March 1940 through 27 September 1940. Joining the winning side. By the spring of 1940, two major blocs had emerged, directly or indirectly participating in the war. Britain and France aligned with a friendly agreement with Japan and a cautiously positive stance from the United States, and Germany allied Italy and a cordial agreement with the Soviet Union. However, the situation remained fluid, and all depended on the last link of the chain, the relationships between the US and Japan. Despite efforts by Britain and later France to soften American attitudes towards Japan, both US policy and public opinion remained steadfastly anti-Japanese. The Americans were furious with Japan's imperial aspirations in the Pacific and its treatment of the populations in conquered territories, such as Manchuria and Korea, or the brutal Nanjing Massacre. In January 1940, the U.S. withdrew from its 1911 commercial treaty with Japan due to its continuing invasion of China, a bold move considering the dependence of Japan on U.S. products. Following their two countries' March agreement, Chamberlain and Renaud, Daladier's successor, attempted to convince President Roosevelt that defeating Hitler was far more critical than the backward politics of China and the wider Asian region. They urged him to shift American policy toward a more conciliatory stance on Japan, viewing it as a potential means to weaken the Axis and hasten Nazism's defeat. Roosevelt decided to play all his cards. In a secret meeting on 29 March 1940, between Japanese Ambassador Kensuke Horinochi and influential presidential advisor Harry Hopkins, the Japanese proposed a ceasefire in China in exchange for continued trade with the U.S. and American recognition of the tripartite neutrality agreement as a positive, anti-Hitlerite pact. While Hopkins expressed respect for Japan's willingness to cooperate, he made it clear that the U.S. government would accept nothing less than Japan's full withdrawal from China. This was seen as unfriendly by the Japanese, but thanks to the intervention of British and French representatives, the negotiations did not collapse. Both sides agreed to reconvene in 2 weeks. But events unfolded faster than anyone could have anticipated. Germany's spring offensive began on 9 April 1940, with the invasions of Denmark and Norway, both of which quickly fell. Then followed the most unexpected blow: France's stunning defeat and its capitulation on 22 June 1940. It was shocking news for the British, and nullified the importance of the neutrality agreement with Japan. The newly appointed Prime Minister Winston Churchill tried to maneuver by calling the Japanese and U.S. ambassadors into his office as early as 10 June to restart the negotiations. But it was futile. Another inner crisis was quickly unfolding in Japan, and Shigemitsu's influence was waning. After anti-British and anti-US voices were growing after the US refusal of Horinouchi's proposal, and the considerable weakening of the British war position after Dunkirk, pro-German politicians in Japan regained their footing. The Japanese government decided to stall the negotiations without abandoning them until the situation in Europe was cleared out. But this diplomatic game was revealed by the US, who had earlier cracked Japan's secret diplomatic code, Purple. Faced with the revelation, the US abandoned the negotiations, deepening the crisis within Japan. Prime Minister Yonai was forced to resign, and on 22 July 1940, the architect of Japan's expansionist policies, Fumimaro Konoe, was reappointed as Prime Minister. 3 days later, the U.S. imposed a ban on the export of U.S. high-octane aviation gasoline and certain grades of steel and scrap iron to Japan. The British saw their whole effort to bring the Japanese closer to them collapse entirely. In August 1940, Tokyo proclaimed the creation of a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was followed by a daring invasion of French Indochina from 22 to 26 September 1940. This clear violation of the Neutrality Pact signed with France just 6 months earlier was justified by Japan on the grounds that the radically changed situation in France released them from all obligations. Japan argued that the new French government was in no position to guarantee Japanese interests in Asia, forcing Japan to secure its position on its own. Hitler and Mussolini quickly congratulated Japan on their actions, and after swift negotiations, Japan formally joined the Axis alliance on 27 September 1940. The rest, as they say, is history. Conclusion. The Neutrality Pact and the associated initiatives, such as the roles of Shigemitsu and the diplomatic efforts by Chamberlain and Wood, are fictional elements. However, the characters involved and the broader events which highlight the instability of alliances up to 1940 are grounded in historical fact. It is true that Japan quickly understood the Nazi-Soviet pact for what it really was, a temporary convenience, and thus did not perceive it as a direct threat to their security. But it is also true that many pro-British factions in Japan viewed Hitler's unpredictable international moves with suspicion. Had the United government come into power in August 1939, rather than January 1940, as it did in reality, such negotiations with Britain could plausibly have taken place. The manner in which France was brought into the negotiations also reflects the actual imbalance within the Anglo-French alliance, with France often following Britain's lead, as seen with the declaration of war in September 1939. But in the end, Japan's alignment with the Axis, especially after France's utter defeat, was likely unavoidable, and this is where fiction ends and history starts. Japan could have used a friendship with Britain and France, and could have counted on a German defeat, or at least a stalemate, to soften U.S. opposition to its policies in China. Yet, as this scenario was highly improbable, Japanese leaders might have also viewed this overture to Britain as a means to improve their standing with Germany and Italy. In this early stage of the war, all could have happened, but it is rarely the case that someone joins the losing side. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts, questions, or ideas for future videos in the comments. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for new content from history, your ultimate source for alternate history entertainment.